Hello, everyone. Happy 420. Thank you for coming to my talk. I am Terrence from Arbitrum. I work on Prysm. It's a consensus layer client and written in Go. So today I want to talk to you guys about the Nets scalability upgrade, EIP4844. I'm sure most of you guys have heard at this point. So let's get started. So outline. So you can't really talk about scalability without talking about the roll-up-century roadmap, right? And then after we talk about the roll-up-century roadmap, we're gonna talk about EIP4844, like a quick overview, very high level. What is EIP4844? Then at 3 and 4, I'm gonna be a little bit more technical, and hopefully it doesn't become too boring. So I hope to spend more time on 1 and 2, and on 3 and 4, I can quickly just speed through it. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to come find me after. So refresher, what is this roll-up-century roadmap? So triangle, you guys have all seen this triangle before. Essentially, the triangle basically says that we have 3 points. We have scalability, we have decentralization, we have security. And it's impossible to hit all 3 points, right? So you have to make trade-off. And the trade-off that Ethereum makes today is that we are decentralized and we're secure, but we are quite slow, right? And this is part of our DNA. We don't want to sacrifice security and decentralization with speed. So this is where we operate at the bottom. And this is Ethereum today. We process about 25 ERC transactions per second, 50 transfers per second, and then you can do a few very fancy transactions here and there. So average about 10 transactions per second. So now the question is, how do we increase the TPS? How do we increase the block space? How do we compete with this global internet of value, right? And if you look at Visa today, Visa processed $3.9 billion of cards worldwide. It processed about 80 million transactions, and then $255 billion of total transactions, blah, 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 right? So this is Visa, and then how do we essentially compete with this internet global of value? And unfortunately, so the hard truth is that you can't, right? Because we are not willing to sacrifice decentralization with scalability. So what do we do here, right? So we cannot increase the block space, we cannot increase the gas limit, and then given the decentralization is in our DNA, and so here comes the roll-up-century roadmap. So a good analogy that Ben Edgerton was said the other day, I think it's really relevant, is if you look at Manhattan, right, it's some of the most expensive real estate out there, but because of economic force, right, it make people start making taller and taller buildings. You're packing more stuff on top of it, and then the land is still very expensive, but you afford to pack more stuff in there. And I think the similar analogy could be also translated into our roadmap. So today with layer 2, you have your 10 transactions per second on layer 1, and then you have layer 2, which is using layer 1 as code data, and then layer 2 are able to process more transactions because of with different security trade-offs, and then it's optimized for throughput and UX, right? And then but layer 2 and layer 1 still shares the same security. Layer 2 cannot rock you, for example. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you still have apps that are willing to settle on layer 1 because they still want the security of layer 1, and then they're just paying a little bit more. So this is what the roll-up-century roadmap is. And then with EIP4844, instead of using code data previously, we are giving a new type of data that's called blob data. And blob data can enable people to process more transactions because it's cheaper, and which I will get into more why. But then if there's one thing to remember, is EIP4844 uses blob data, and then blob data enables layer 2s to process more transactions per second. So how do we go with cold data to blob data without sacrificing decentralization, right? So that goes back to my earlier point that we do not want to sacrifice decentralization. But here, we're actually processing more transactions. So what do we do here, right? So this is where I'm going to go a little bit overview on EIP4844. So what is EIP4844? How does it enable you to process more transactions without sacrificing decentralization? So this is the image. This the only thing to remember, just remember this image. The EIP4844 bolts blobs onto the block, right? So blobs are not part of the block. Blobs are not inside the block. So blobs are bolted in the block. Remember this mental image? And then, so how does this work, right? So this requires you to be computationally binding to a block, meaning that if you commit something from the blob into the block, you cannot change it later, right? So you have this like computational binding scheme, for example, like SHA-256, Merkle root, polynomial commitment. So it uses some binding scheme to ensure that once you bolt the blob onto the block, that cannot be changed later. So what are commitments, right? So commitments like SHA-256, Merkle tree, KZG. So for EIP4844, we're using KZG commitment. So we're using KZG commitment. So we take the blob, we run through some KZG hashing functions, we get a commitment, we put that in the block, and then we run another hashing function and put it in the payload, which is used on the execution layer. And then we want to use the hash because it's 32 byte. We want to be EVM friendly. And then also, one nice property of this is that it basically enables us to verify the blob's integrity later through EVM very easily. We basically code that just to open a polynomial at any point. So here are some comparison of block versus blob, right? So block are seen by all the nodes. So is blob. Blob are seen by all the nodes. So you have this like. So they're both like they all basically have to pay this network bandwidth to get both objects. So the block are 1 megabit theoretical limit today, and then blob are 128 target to 56 KB max. So EIP1559 style. The block are stored on the execution client, so like Geth, Nethermind, and then the blob are actually stored on the consensus client, for example, like Lighthouse, like Teku, Nimbus. And then, so the last three are the main differences, and the differences are the reason why the blob is so much cheaper, right? Because the block has EVM access, so that means that you have to pay compute power to access through EVM. And then it's also stored forever, right? So for example, if you put a code data out there, all the nodes have to store it. So you have this like longevity cost for basically for all the nodes. And then right now it's 16 gas per byte for block. So versus the blob, you don't have EVM access. So blob actually cannot access the EVM, but blob can actually access the proof of the blob's integrity. And then you only need to store for 18 days. So this is mainly used for the roll-up challenge period. So given that it's 18 days, and then it can be DD later, that's why we're able to price it relatively cheap, right? So on the block, you have this EVM and gas, and on the blob side, you have this cheap data gas. So what is a blob transaction? So the blob transaction is essentially a transaction with all the data or OPEC data. It's submitted to the execution layer mempool, and then it's gossip among all the execution layer clients, and then it has a new transaction type 0x05. It has all the usual data field like nonce, value, code data, and then it has this new field, it's called blob version hashes, which allow you to verify the commitment scheme. And then it's encoded as SSZ instead of RLP. This is the new hashing algorithm that consensus layer client has been using. So this is how end-to-end will look like with layer 2. So EIP4844, like I feel like that's something that you and I probably will not use this type of thing because the data will be deleted later and the EVM cannot access it. But turns out this is very useful for layer 2 to basically post data on chain, right? So as a layer 2, you have your sequencer, you have your batch poster, you basically essentially you gather all the transactions data, and then you compress it, you batch it, you submit it to the layer 1 execution layer client mempool, and then execution layer client gossip those data together. And then on the right-hand side, you have your consensus layer, you have your validator. So validator wants to propose a block, it gets the block bundle, it signs it, and then it propagates it among all the consensus layer peers, right? And then consensus layer peers also verify the blob is integrity with their own execution layer client. And then on the layer 2 side, you have also your layer 2 validators, and then your layer 2 validators are actually the ones that's reading the blobs, verifying. So therefore, you have layer 2 come into consensus with each other, verify that no one's cheating, and then on the right-hand side, you have your layer 1 coming to consensus with each other. So yeah, it is quite beautiful. So I have about 7 minutes, so I'm gonna run through some of the consensus layer nodes. So this might get more like nitty-gritty and stuff like that, so just bear with me. So what are the changes here, right? The changes here are the blobs are stored for 18 days, okay? And there's like not that many economic incentive for you to store data for 18 days, right? For example, like today I can just be like, okay, I'm supposed to store for 18 days, I'm gonna delete it like 1 day later, I don't care. So there's no way to really enforce that, to like slash you, to make you lose money, right? The only thing we can do is like, as a peer, I can ask whether you have a blob, and you say, no, I don't have it. Then I was like, okay, well, you are a shady peer, I'm gonna drop you from the network, right? So like something to think about is like, is there a better like incentive alignment there? Like, can we do something better there versus just like this honesty assumption that we trust like nodes will store 18 days of blobs all the time. Maybe we can have some like data retention, policing nodes, something like that. Also right now for the consensus layer client, we're syncing from which subjectivity checkpoint. So if we do that, we also have the backfilling all the blobs. So those are some of the storage nodes I have. And then you have your new full choice rule, right? So for now, if you import the block can be valid or not. But if the block is valid, you're safe. Then the block should be safe in the DB. But in order to do that, you have to make sure that block must have like blobs on the side as well. So that means that you should not be importing the block unless you have the blobs. So there's like implementation complexity here where you have to like queue the block until the blob arrives, or you have to queue the blob until the block arrives. So you have to kind of wait for each other. So you have these like state machines basically you have to play. And then for blob syncing as well, to sync to the head of the chain. So the blobs are synced alongside the blocks. So there's 2 ways to sync. You can do syncing by range, meaning this is more like long range syncing, or you can do syncing by root, which is more recent, meaning that I'm just syncing each blob individually, versus syncing by range means that I'm syncing the blob like through like 512 times at once. And then the peer will also reply resource unavailable if they don't have the blob. But doing that, they would get destroyed, and then you would just drop the peer. So it's important to care for basically what you request. So you don't want to request data that's outside the 18 days window. And then, so you also gossip the blob as well, yeah? Just say if you're the head of the chain, you propose a block, you propose a blobs, then you have the gossip among your peers, and then all the blobs are propagated in parallel, so you have different matches of blobs, and then once the blobs gets verified, you basically rebroadcast them. So there are very like fun like engineering tricks that you can do to optimize bandwidth, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to working on that. And then blob storage, so each blob is stored for 18 days. So the upper bound is that if you're running a node today, you're gonna have an extra 67 gigabyte, assuming the blob is always filled. That is very unlikely. That means that Ethereum gas will be through off the roof and it will be burning tons of ETH. So 67 GB is the worst case scenario, and we likely will not get there. And then The block and blob separation also enable better persistent storage design, meaning that you can store your block in SSD because that's something that needs to be fast, and then you can store your blobs in hard drive because that's something that you probably will not read very often. So lots of client implementation details here. And then blob retrieval. So you want to get a blob. How do you get it? So there's an API for that. So you can get the blob whenever you want. And then there's utilities written by Mofi on blob utils. And then there's a blob scanner as well. So you can actually view the blobs online. So blob signing, so validator signs the blob, so validator will get the blob from the API. You will sign with this new domain blob sidecar. So one thing that's interesting is there's no slashing for equivocation. So if you sign double blobs, you will not get slashed, but you are at risk of missing the block. Because say today, someone requests your double blobs, because you can only have one blob per block, right? So you cannot have duplicated blobs per block. So if today you double sign, then if the node gets the faulty one first, then the node will not process your block. So it's more like an economic enforcement to make sure people don't double sign versus like a slashing condition. And blob publishing, so as a validator, you publish the blob, you go through the Beacon API, and then you submit it to the consensus layer client, and then consensus layer client will broadcast it for you. And then with MEV Boost, yes, about 95% of the validators today uses MEV Boost, so that's something that we're still trying to figure out, so definitely watch for the PR on that. One open question is that should we have blind blob signing or should we have full blob signing? I guess it depends whether like you think the blob can be front run, and then also latency matters here. So the earlier we can design this, the test is the better, but this is still like an open question right now. So okay, EIP4844 now. So where are we today? So we have the spec. The spec is getting ready to be finalized. We have the execution EIP spec. We have the APIs. We have 5 consensus layer client implementation. We have 4 execution. Client implementation. So I would say most of the clients are ready for the testing. We have launched 4 devnets. So devnet 5 is coming in 2 to 3 weeks. We have some tooling. We have blob scan. And then we have KZG ceremony, which is ongoing. So if you haven't participated in the KZG ceremony, please, please do it. And then some devnet history. So here are the devnets. So we started from devnet 1, which is Prysm get only. And then we started devnet 2. We added this data gas. And then we started devnet 3, which we based on top of Shanghai withdrawal. And then devnet 4 was the latest one, which we have this blob syncing. So all the clients were able to sync blobs. And devnet 5, where you essentially it's a new approach. We decouple blobs and blobs TS and the TS mempool hardening. So blob v4 will come in. Blob v5, will come in a few weeks. Okay, so last slide. So how can you help, right? So if you want to help, if you're interested, you can follow client progresses. There's weekly implementation code, EIP4844 weekly implementation code. And then we have follow the R&D Discord channels. You can run client test softwares, find bugs, open issues, and then or just write blogs, right? Just write education materials. People are usually very appreciative when you do that. And then look out for bounties, grants, and everything. So yeah, that's it from me. This is the last slide. So this is blobfish. So blobfish is the official is the official animal for 4844 because of blob space. So yeah, thank you for listening to me talk.